Hello. That was a section from the 9th movement of my 3rd symphony, entitled Of Berdiev and Gubaidulina's Offertorium. I've come to the Jacobskirche in Weimar, the St. James Parish Church. There are tombs here pertaining to both Lucas Cranach the Elder and Friedrich Schiller in the cemetery. There's also a stone monument to Martin Gottlieb Klauer, who designed the Neptune fountain in the Marktplatz. This original site was established in the 12th century, although the current Baroque building dates back just 300 years, Johann Sebastian Bach having been involved with the inauguration, although I'm told the bells in the wooden belfry date from before then. It's very small inside, but it was used as the ducal court church after fire destroyed the Weimar castle in 1774, and Goethe was married here, and there are still regular services and concerts today in the same building. I heard a wonderful performance of the Ligeti second string quartet very recently. But actually, I've come here because I'd like to return in part to a religious theme. My symphony makes reference to the work of Nikolai Berdiev, who wrote early in the 20th century of his dissatisfaction with the patristic tradition of Eastern Christian orthodoxy. He argued that dogma prevented a genuine inquiry into the nature of meaning and truth. He said the reality of God is grasped not through a descriptive history of ideas, but through recognition that profane solutions to problems of profound meaning are inevitably insufficient. Influenced by Kierkegaard and Dostoevsky, he examined existential notions of suffering and freedom and applied them to various matters pertaining to the human condition, ranging from divine presence to social justice. Thereafter, Sofia Gubaidulina, the Russian composer who now lives in Hamburg, looked to Berdiev during the post-Second World War decades in response to feeling dehumanized by the political circumstances of Soviet Russia and the totalitarian control that was exercised over music culture. I chose this movement from my 3rd symphony because I'd like to return to the theme of how to reconcile secular and religious truth. How can an international school, or any community for that matter committed to the principles of multiculturalism and pluralism, accommodate values that on the surface seem contradictory? To put it in terms of learning outcomes, how can children be expected to learn scientific knowledge if their parents worry that this scientific knowledge contradicts the revealed religious truth of their heritage? There are other issues underpinning this dilemma, which I've touched on several times previously. If a person is said to believe something, or know something that's not provable, whatever that something might be, how might it be possible for them to justify that belief? For instance, if I walk into a room and I believe there's a score of Gubaidulina's Offertorium in the top drawer of my desk, I might not know for sure that it's there because the drawer is closed and I cannot validate things with my own eyes. However, in this case, I might justify the belief based upon another person's testimony. Only 5 minutes ago, my wife told me she put it in the drawer yesterday. So, I walk up to the desk and open the drawer, and lo and behold, I find the score. Now I know it's there by way of a different justification. I justify it by having seen that it's there, which may not be an absolute formal proof, but it's a stronger form of justification at least. After all, as regards my previous stance, my wife might have been teasing me, or my son might have taken it out in the meantime and used it as a battle surface for ninja dragons. But now I've seen it with my own eyes, and barring some kind of reading error, perhaps mistaking the work for some other concerto for violin and orchestra, my belief about the score being in the drawer has been shown to be justified and true. However, the nature of truth is not always so straightforward. Here's another example. The statement of truth, "my playing football causes my team to lose," seems reasonable at first glance, given I'm not as fast a runner as I used to be. However, in this case, there may be other factors at play affecting the fact that my team loses. As it stands, the proposition is inadequate. It's a fallacy. In and of itself, it has no truth value. If I want to say something that's definitively true, I could say instead, "my playing football causes my team to win, draw or lose," which is a logically true statement. If I was to not play, then it wouldn't be my team, and so assuming I am playing, and assuming I play for one team only, and that even if there's a plague of ninja dragons at half-time, the game finishes, then my team must by necessity win, draw or lose. By definition, there are no other options. Therefore, the statement has to be true. But as I said, things are not so straightforward. If truth P is said to cause truth Q, and if the relationship between the two is dependent on the process of causing, then it must be recognised that there are many ways to define this causal process, some of which are common sense according to ordinary use language, and others of which are counterintuitive. The simplest interpretation is a standard modus tollens relationship, as shown by the football example, whereby the antecedent P logically necessitates the consequent Q. If I play football, then my team will win, draw or lose. If P, then Q. But here's another example. If the score of Gubaidulina's offertorium is in the draw, then it's not on the piano. In this case, if the cause is an entailment, then on the surface, the statement P, the score of Gubaidulina's offertorium is in the draw, entails the statement Q, it's not on the piano. Yet, according to the theory of logical entailment, if the consequent Q is necessarily true, then there's no way for the entailment statement to be false, whether the antecedent P is true or not. Consequently, a necessary truth Q is entailed by everything else. So, if the proposition my team will win, draw or lose is taken to be a necessary truth, then the statement the score of Gubaidulina's offertorium is in the draw entails that my football team will win, draw or lose is true. Counterintuitive, but true. The point to be taken from this, as understood by Berdiev and Gubaidulina and Schelling before, is that knowledge of the world must rely upon more than rationality alone. It must look to an honest account of what we actually see. Plato wrote in the Republic, "The cave is a world of sight, the fire is the sun, the way upwards is a way to knowledge, and in the world of knowledge the idea of good is last to be seen, and with difficulty, but when seen is inferred to be the author of good and right, parent of the Lord of light in this world, and of truth and understanding in the other world." Epistemology in the modern era has also found the issues of how the world works or what the world is irresistible. It's asked, how can we know how the world works or what the world is? In the 17th century, Gottfried Leibniz in nearby Hanover revived the Neoplatonist doctrine whereby we know things by way of innate ideas, while his contemporary, John Locke, refuted the mere possibility of innate knowledge, even of that pertaining to mathematics and logic. Locke said that the mind of the newborn child begins with a blank slate, the tabula rasa, and that knowledge is derived from experience of the world. Belief is developed as a tentative explanation of the world, requiring truth and justification. Thereafter, David Hume, an empiricist like Locke, tried to fathom the problem of induction, the fact that identifying patterns in the past to inform the future, recognising, for instance, the fact that all violin concertos of the past have included an orchestral accompaniment, implies that all violin concertos of the future will have the same characteristic, is not a sound base for knowledge. Then came Kant and the German idealists, and the transformation of epistemology by way of theories pertaining to cognitive structures, and, in the Weimar identity thesis, the relationship of those structures to those of the natural world. But in the 20th century there was a splintering of paths, from Getty's exposing the incoherency of standard definitions of knowledge, the Carnap's rejection of epistemology altogether, and his consequent quest for a theoretical grounding for empirical knowledge. Today I want to look at three of those pathways that might be of relevance and interest to my ongoing inquiry. The Naturalized Epistemology of Willard Klein, justifying scientific knowledge, and the non-empirical epistemologies of Alvin Plantinga and John Hick, justifying religious knowledge. Given the problems like those associated with causality and entailment, and in particular the implications for music scores and football games, Matthias Stoyp said, "One primary task of epistemology is to identify how knowledge and justification are anchored in the natural world, just as it is the purpose of physics to explain phenomena like heat and cold or thunder and lightning in terms of properties of the natural world." Accordingly, naturalized epistemology posits that the foundations of knowledge should be located in the conceptions of the world that people develop from common sense and from science, rather than from the narrower bounds of self-reflective introspection. It should be focused on the means by which it's possible to develop theory on the basis of empirical evidence alone, irrespective of transcendental constraints. thereby shifting the role of epistemology in general from that of foundational philosophy, as it had been with Kant, to that of a side branch of psychology. Stoip said that to avoid arcane debates in the attempt to tackle questions to which there are no answers, to bring epistemology on the right path, it must be made a part of the natural sciences and become cognitive psychology. The aim of naturalistic epistemology, thus understood, is to replace traditional epistemology with an altogether new and redefined project. One of the leading exponents of naturalized epistemology during my lifetime has been Willard Quine. He argued in his Epistemology Naturalized, published in 1969, that empiricism alone is epistemologically fundamental to scientific knowledge. He rejected the idea that knowledge derived of a scientific methodology requires further independent justification beyond that methodology. Quine argued that the study of the human mind should be treated no differently than the study of other natural phenomena. He said that in considering a human subject, the relation between the meagre input and the torrential output is a relation that we are prompted to study for somewhat the same reasons that always prompted epistemology, namely, in order to see how evidence relates to theory, and in what ways one's theory of nature transcends any available evidence. Accordingly, traditional forms of epistemology are considered ill-suited to science, a position that Quine took further. He argued that all knowledge is empirical knowledge. He rejected the analytic-synthetic division between types of knowledge that was so important to the logical positivist generation before him. He argued that, in fact, all knowledge is synthetic. Science is merely an extension of common sense, and therefore it's everything. Even analytic a priori knowledge, derived by a rational methodology, is also synthetic at core. It's discovered empirically. I think it's reasonable to say that Quine is to empiricism what Kant is to reason. Empiricism is a fundamental tool of understanding, which means that the long tradition of epistemics and justified true belief is not valid for anything. It's been sent to the epistemological rubbish bin. Empiricism is the only show in town. In justifying his approach, Quine argued that this is the inevitable consequence of a naturalistic view of the world. If everything in the world is ultimately a part of nature, and nature is known to humans through the senses, then it's not possible to separate sentences that are expressions of empirical knowledge from those that are not. He justified his ideas further by using the Humean argument that all generalizations, or rules, or the laws of science are fallible and subject to revision. They overreach the evidence used to justify them. Consequently, the methodology underpinning them is not inductive at all, but raw empirical knowledge. Even logic and mathematics are subject to the same principle. We know that 2 + 2 is 4, not because we can deduce it in our heads, or because our mathematician colleagues can justify its set logic, but because we've experienced it as true, and by convention extended that knowledge to a kind of rule of thumb. He concluded that as knowledge can be shown as based on experience alone, it's empirical knowledge, which in turn means it's justified by, and only by, empiricism. There have been many objections to naturalized epistemology, in particular pertaining to the fact that while it claims to completely take over the role of epistemology, it doesn't address much of the subject matter covered by traditional epistemics, such as the analysis of concepts. It doesn't seek to identify the nature of knowledge and the necessary and sufficient conditions required for a person to know something. In other words, it's too simplistic. It doesn't even deal with the process by which humans acquire knowledge, which in turn can provide a response to skepticism. Naturalized epistemology doesn't address the issue of how to discount the possibility that human beliefs around the world might be profoundly mistaken. Its case is weakened by arguments that it's simply not interested in such matters. Most importantly to my current narrative, one of the most significant differences between empirical and traditional epistemology can be seen in the fact that the former embodies an account of normative standards of right and wrong, good and bad, whereas naturalized epistemology does not. Science is always neutral and impartial, and its methodologies aim to be too. Like its logical positivist precursor, it's supposedly non-teleological and depoliticized. It avoids taking an ethical stance, whereas first construct epistemology makes judgments. If naturalized epistemology has been popular in recent decades among the science community, then, given that religious people maintain truth is not a part of the natural world, faith has looked to other justifications for knowledge, including ethical knowledge. Alvin Plantinga's reformed epistemology took the approach of focusing upon the supposed infallibilism of human experience. I'll try to illustrate this in a straightforward way. If a person sees a Gubaidulina score in front of them, or a football for that matter, then whether or not the ball is actually there, they see a ball. For them, it's there. Assuming the person possesses the standard faculties of cognition, and the person is not actually an Everton supporter like me and prone to wild hallucinations, then the experience itself cannot be questioned. It's infallible. Consequently, the belief held by the person is given a justified epistemic status. The existence of the ball is foundational knowledge to the subject. It becomes the base upon which all of their other knowledge is built, including the need to kick the ball in the right direction if the game is to be won. Hint, hint. In a similar way, if the person perceives God by way of an inner vision, then this can also be treated as foundational knowledge. It's made infallible merely by the fact that they have experienced it. This knowledge is therefore considered justified and the base upon which all else will be built. Thereafter, beyond assumptions that the person is of sound mind, there's no need to be concerned further about whether or not God is actually there. For a Christian, according to Plantinga, this correspondence is made secure through faith in the efficacy of the Holy Spirit, which acts to cause these beliefs in the believer in the first place. This is an argument that was used by 18th century thinkers too, including Descartes and Berkeley. It is God himself that makes belief in God reliable. The person has faith, which itself is a gift from God, to believe that the perception of God by way of this inner vision is perceived as infallible knowledge for reasons of divine purpose. Consequently, the person's main concern can remain with religious experience and revelation itself. They are justified epistemologically in asserting that their belief in God can be justified independently of empirical evidence. They are justified in believing that they're right and everybody else is wrong. If this approach lends itself to religious fundamentalism, then another figure working in the field of religious epistemology, John Hick, has been one of the most influential thinkers pertaining to religious pluralism. Hick was heavily influenced by Kant's transcendental epistemology and Herder's cultural relativism, and the view that human knowledge of reality is obscured by mental function and is historically situated. In contrast to Plantinga, he argued that absolute truth claims pertaining to God are merely assertions about subjective perceptions. They're claims about the phenomenal God rather than the noumenal God. Moreover, given that knowledge is grounded by experience and thereafter interpreted by human modes of thinking, knowledge of God will inevitably be shaped by cultural and historical influences. Richard Peters wrote that Hick rejects naive realism whereby ultimate reality is as I experience it. Hick believes that ultimate reality is hidden even in our experience of it, and that it's possible to confuse actual with counterfeit religious experience. To handle a problem caused by the fact that our categories shape our experience of the ultimate, Hick recommends that we regard our religious traditions as significantly comprised of myths that are literally false, even if true as descriptions of our experience of ultimate reality. Hick was deeply influenced by atheists and those belonging to other faiths who he saw as aspiring to the same values as those espoused by his religion, Christianity. This influence led him to question the particular doctrine espoused by many religions of how a loving God could possibly sentence non-believers, who otherwise advocate many shared religious doctrines, to an eternity of damnation. He argued this dogma was incoherent. He moved towards pluralism as a way of reconciling divine love with the realities of cultural and religious diversity. Peters wrote, "In response to the problem provided by the counterfeit religious experience, Hick recommends that we look for the long-term transformative effect on the experiencer as an indication of the value and authenticity of any would-be religious experience. Authentic encounters with the ultimate ought to produce compassion, love, and other valuable attitudes and emotions within the life of the experiencer." There are a number of issues that come to my own mind while looking at these different viewpoints. One being the irony of a situation whereby a scientist can create firm foundations for science knowledge, and a religious person can create firm foundations for religious knowledge. As Kant said, we humans have the capacity to rationalise justification for almost any conceivable human activity. Having said that, I have sympathy for Quine's approach. His modest and objective approach suggests this is not a self-indulgent one. He would concede that if a Gubaidulina concerto, or a football, or an invading mass of ninja dragons were revealed to be a better determiner of, for instance, the law of falling bodies than modern theories espoused by the physics or cosmology communities, then it would be appropriate to abandon the physics and cosmology and look to the music for answers to the riddles of gravity. And actually, this points to the major issue I see emerging from this brief survey of some of late 20th century epistemology. I see a common theme emerging in Quine and Hick, if not Plantinga. I'm drawn to make the suggestion, given the tendency to privilege metaphor and equivalences as a first construct, that religious pluralism is to religious infallibilism what coherence is to foundationalism, and what scientific realism is to metaphysical realism. That's to say, religious pluralism, just like the scientific method, can be seen to justify itself by way of a best fit methodology. If infallibility and absolute truth leads to fundamentalism and ultimately intolerance and violence, then the fallibility and relative truth of the Kantian and the Weimar identity thesis leads to open-mindedness and respect, in which case the latter can be seen to represent the best fit with the values of love and compassion espoused. If the choice of best fit epistemology is suited to both empirical and religious truth, the outstanding question has to be, who decides the best fit? Everybody? Anybody? Is this to be a matter of shared knowledge or private knowledge? Or is that subject to the same best fit principle too? Either way, this particular pathway through the maze of knowledge theory seems to point to a virtue epistemology, which I introduced in a previous episode. I'll finish by playing another short section from the 9th movement of my 3rd symphony. Thanks for listening.